Stephen J. Russell was born on September 14, 1957, in the small town of Norfolk, Virginia. His parents, Helen and Robert Russell, were hard-working middle-class citizens who believed in the American dream. They instilled in young Stephen the values of honesty, hard work, and determination. However, Stephen had other plans. From a young age, he displayed an uncanny ability to manipulate situations to his advantage. Growing up, Stephen was a bright student, but he was always more interested in the challenge of bending the rules than in following them. His teachers noticed his quick wit and ability to think on his feet. At home, his charm and intelligence often got him out of trouble, leaving his parents blissfully unaware of his growing penchant for mischief. During his teenage years, Stephen's fascination with deception grew. He started small, conning his classmates out of their lunch money and sneaking into movie theaters without paying. These early exploits gave him a taste for the thrill of the con, and he quickly became addicted to the rush of outsmarting others. After graduating from high school, Stephen found himself at a crossroads. His parents wanted him to go to college and pursue a respectable career, but Stephen had other ideas. He decided to join the police force, seeing it as an opportunity to learn the inner workings of law enforcement from the inside. His parents were proud of his decision, believing it was a sign of maturity and responsibility. Stephen's time in the police force was short-lived. While he excelled in his training and quickly gained the trust of his colleagues, he found the work tedious and unfulfilling. It was during this time that he met Philip Morris, a charismatic and charming man who would change the course of his life forever. Philip and Stephen's relationship blossomed quickly. Stephen fell deeply in love with Philip, and the two men began to dream of a life filled with luxury and excitement. However, their lavish lifestyle required money, something they both lacked. Stephen, always the schemer, saw an opportunity to use his skills for more lucrative ventures. Leaving the police force behind, Stephen embarked on a series of increasingly audacious cons. He used his knowledge of law enforcement to orchestrate elaborate fraud schemes, embezzling money from insurance companies, and scamming businesses out of thousands of dollars. His charm and wit made him nearly untouchable, and he reveled in the thrill of his newfound life. However, Stephen's criminal activities eventually caught up with him. In 1992, he was arrested and sentenced to prison for insurance fraud. For most, this would have been the end of the road, but for Stephen it was just the beginning of his legendary escapades. Stephen's first prison escape was a masterpiece of simplicity and ingenuity. While incarcerated, he noticed that the prison uniforms were color-coded for different roles within the facility. Using green markers from the prison art supply, he meticulously dyed his uniform to match those worn by medical staff. On the day of his escape, Stephen walked confidently through the prison, impersonating a doctor. His calm demeanor and medical disguise allowed him to blend in with the staff, and he walked right out of the prison gates. It wasn't until hours later that the guards realized he was missing, and by then, Stephen was long gone. Stephen's escape sparked a massive manhunt. Authorities were baffled by the audacity and simplicity of his plan. Media outlets across the country picked up the story, dubbing him the King of Cons. Meanwhile, Stephen was already planning his next move, knowing that he needed to stay one step ahead of the law. Despite his best efforts to remain hidden, Stephen was recaptured several months later. His return to prison was met with increased security measures, but Stephen's spirit remained unbroken. He began to plot his next escape, determined to regain his freedom. In his new prison, Stephen was subjected to tighter security. However, his spirit was far from broken. He knew that escape was still possible, and he began to concoct a new plan. This time, it involved faking a medical emergency. Stephen had always been a keen observer, and he noticed that prisoners who suffered from serious health issues were often transferred to hospitals for treatment. He began studying medical books and talking to inmates with health problems, learning the symptoms of various conditions. He settled on a heart attack, knowing it would require immediate attention. One sweltering afternoon, Stephen put his plan into action. He clutched his chest and collapsed in his cell, gasping for breath. His cellmate called for help, and within minutes, guards and medical staff were rushing to his aid. Stephen was taken to the prison infirmary, where he continued to exhibit symptoms of a heart attack. Believing his condition was life-threatening, the prison's medical team decided to transfer him to a nearby hospital. Stephen was transported under heavy guard, but he had anticipated this. Once at the hospital, he used his charm and knowledge of law enforcement protocols to impersonate an FBI agent on the phone. He convinced the hospital staff that he was part of an undercover operation and needed to be released immediately. Once again, Stephen walked out of captivity, leaving behind bewildered guards and hospital staff. In his new prison, Stephen was subjected to tighter security. However, his spirit was far from broken. He knew that escape was still possible, and he began to concoct a new plan. Back in prison, Stephen was now considered one of the most notorious escape artists in the country. He was placed in solitary confinement and subjected to constant surveillance. But even under these conditions, his mind was always working, looking for the next opportunity. Stephen knew that the key to his next escape lay in the legal system. He began studying legal books, learning about court procedures and the intricacies of bail and release orders. After months of meticulous planning, he concocted an audacious plan to forge his own release. Using smuggled materials, Stephen created fake court orders reducing his bail amount. He then placed a series of phone calls to the court clerk, impersonating a judge and instructing her to process his release. His performance was so convincing that the clerk followed his instructions without question. On the day of his supposed release, Stephen walked confidently out of the prison, holding the forged documents. The guards, believing the orders to be genuine, allowed him to leave. It wasn't until days later that the fraud was discovered, and by then, Stephen had vanished once more. Free again, Stephen resumed his life of crime, this time with even greater caution. He created a new identity, using his skills to forge an entire backstory complete with fake documents, social security numbers, and financial records. Under the name John Wainwright, he moved to New York City and began working as a financial consultant. In this new role, Stephen found ample opportunities to engage in fraud. He embezzled funds from clients, orchestrated elaborate Ponzi schemes, and lived a life of luxury. Despite his efforts to stay under the radar, his extravagant lifestyle and high-profile cons eventually attracted attention. In late 1995, a disgruntled client tipped off the authorities, leading to an investigation that uncovered Stephen's true identity. Once again, he was arrested and sent back to prison, this time to a maximum security facility designed to prevent any possibility of escape. Stephen's fourth escape was his most elaborate and daring. Faced with the prospect of spending the rest of his life in a maximum security prison, he devised a plan that involved faking a terminal illness. He began by researching the symptoms of AIDS, a condition that was still poorly understood and often resulted in compassionate release for terminally ill prisoners. Using laxatives and other means, Stephen simulated the symptoms of AIDS, losing weight rapidly and exhibiting signs of severe illness. He forged medical records and manipulated the prison's medical staff into believing he was dying. Convinced of his condition, the authorities transferred him to a hospice for terminally ill patients. In the hospice, Stephen's situation seemed dire, but he was far from giving up. He used his charm to befriend the staff and volunteers, gaining their trust. He then made a series of phone calls, impersonating doctors and convincing the hospice administration that his death was imminent. He even went as far as to forge a death certificate. One evening, under the guise of transferring his body for cremation, Stephen walked out of the hospice and disappeared into the night. His escape was so convincing that it took weeks for the authorities to realize he was still alive. Now a fugitive once more, Stephen adopted yet another identity and continued his life of crime. He traveled extensively, from the bustling streets of New York City to the quiet suburbs of the Midwest. Each new city brought new opportunities for cons and fraud, and Stephen reveled in the freedom and excitement of his lifestyle. However, the constant pressure of living on the run took its toll. Stephen's health began to deteriorate, and the authorities were closing in. In 1998, after a tip from an informant, he was finally recaptured in a dramatic raid. This time, he was placed in solitary confinement in a high-security prison, with round-the-clock surveillance to ensure he could never escape again. Stephen's life in solitary confinement was a far cry from the freedom he had once enjoyed. Confined to a small cell for 23 hours a day, he had little contact with the outside world. The constant surveillance and lack of human interaction took a severe toll on his mental health, but his spirit remained unbroken. During his time in solitary, Stephen reflected on his life and the choices he had made. He corresponded with Philip Morris, who remained supportive despite the distance and the circumstances. Their letters were a lifeline for Stephen, providing a sense of connection and hope. Stephen's exploits had made him a legend, and the media continued to follow his story closely. In 2003, his life was immortalized in the film I Love You, Philip Morris, starring Jim Carrey and Ewan McGregor. The film highlighted his extraordinary escapes and his love story with Philip, bringing his tale to a new generation. The film's release sparked renewed interest in Stephen's case, and journalists from around the world sought to interview him. While the prison authorities were reluctant to grant access, Stephen managed to smuggle out several letters and statements, sharing his thoughts on his life and the choices he had made. Stephen Russell's story is a testament to the lengths to which a person will go for freedom and love. His escapes were not just acts of defiance but demonstrations of his brilliance and audacity. While his actions were illegal, they were also marked by a certain artistry and flair that made him a legend in his own time. Stephen's legacy continues to captivate the public imagination. His story raises questions about the nature of crime and punishment, the human spirit's unyielding desire for freedom, and the lengths to which one will go for love. In his final years, Stephen remained in solitary confinement, but he continued to correspond with Philip and reflect on his life. He expressed regret for the pain he had caused others, but remained proud of his ability to outsmart the system. His story serves as a reminder of the complexities of the human condition and the endless pursuit of freedom. Stephen Russell, the King of Cons, passed away in his cell in 2020, leaving behind a legacy of audacity, ingenuity, and an unbreakable spirit. His life story, filled with love, deception, and incredible escapes, remains a testament to the power of the human will and the relentless pursuit of freedom.